Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. We are here on this Friday morning to hear an introduction and walk through a little bit of testimony on H641, an act relating to authorizing boards of abatement to cure like cases as a class. And I want to welcome Representative Anthony to tee this up for us.
Thank you very much, members and Mr. Chairman. This is Old Home Week. I spent 2 years during the pension and reapportionment challenges. So I'm happy to be back. 641 is essentially filling a gap in the procedural details which accompany and guide towns who go through an abatement process. And let me just be very brief. The Justice of the Peace, together with the members of the Select Board or City Council, constitute both the Board of Civil Authority and the Board of Abatement. Each of them have separate authorities. The abatement process generally focuses on a real property that is either destroyed, lost, leaves town. There is one of the 4 criteria in the statute involves ability to pay. There's very, very little case law behind this. There is silence in the municipal procedural manual, if you will. There is a guide from the League of Cities and Towns. But again, that's mostly commonsensical drafting, derived partly from the case law that does surround the Board of Civil Authority. In this exigency, very similar to the disaster when Hurricane Irene visited Vermont in 2011. And as those of you who were in the chamber yesterday, I reported out on the floor a companion piece which essentially said the state will assist in the case of communities who lost significant real property grand list and therefore property taxes as a result of flooding within certain parameters and certain time frame. What I thought, and Clerk Treasurer Dawes can add her take on it. I'm a member of the Board of Civil Authority, and so I sort of saw this coming way back in August. And we discussed what would be the appropriate procedure, given that we knew we were going to have scores of applications. And Clerk Dawes can confirm, I think we already have started the abating hearings this upcoming Wednesday night. We'll probably be in session for many weeks. We're 50 plus and counting requests for abatement. And so the question was, if there are very, very alike applications because of landslides, condemnations, can't we hear those, if you will, as a group of virtual identicals, the difference being the address? And I had consulted Abby Shepard, who at that time was still part of Ledge Council, and Tucker Anderson. And frankly, there wasn't a lot of guidance. I said it would be better for the towns to actually have a document that they could point to and say, this is how we can do this while being efficient, but also absolutely certain that we have respected the individual's right to a separate hearing on the individual situation as it arises. That's a due process requirement, essentially. So the language in here actually tries to combine both strategies, class, but opt out for an individual separate hearing if you feel your circumstances are unique in some way, and being a part of a class would disadvantage you in some sense. But that's a sort of roundabout background and summary of why it's here before you. And probably if it weren't for the floods, we wouldn't worry about it, because these are one-offs, the barn burns or something like that. But this has hit scores of dwellings at the same time in the same circumstance. So that's where we are.
Anybody have any questions about the thinking behind the bill? So Representative Anthony, thank you for sort of teeing things up. I think since we have your clerk, who is very familiar to most of us, all of us, Carol Dawes is with us. Do you want to give a little bit of background too before we hear the walkthrough of the bill?
I would be happy to. For the record, Carol Dawes, I'm the Berry City Clerk and Treasurer. And many of you also know me as the chair of the Legislative Committee for the Clerk and Treasurers Association. But I appear before you today as speaking on behalf of the city of Berry. And I thank Representative Anthony and Representative Williams, who have been working on bringing this forward. As you all know, Berry City was hard hit by the flooding in July. And as Representative Anthony said, I actually have 60 abatement requests at this point in time. We've heard a few of them so far, and we've got 40 of them scheduled through the month of February, which doesn't get me the whole list, and I'm expecting there to be more coming forward. And they do have a lot of similarities, and we've been struggling trying to figure out what's the most efficient way, but also the most the fairest way to hold the hearings for like properties. So the opportunity to move them together into classes would help considerably. We've done a lot of work in establishing some applications, establishing questionnaires, different ways to try to gather the information that will help us to the extent that we can clump them together, if you will, but obviously respecting the opportunity for any particular requester to want a distinct hearing, individual hearing, and we will be holding them as individual hearings, knowing that we can only hear so many in a night. So I think that this would be a really helpful situation, hopefully one that towns need very rarely, if ever. But I can imagine future similar floods. I can imagine in a community like Berry City, where we're fairly heavily built out, where a devastating fire could take a number of properties and be in the same class. I don't wish any of those on anybody, but I can see where having this opportunity would be helpful as we move through what are really painful actions, both for the property owners and for the municipalities who are, obviously with the abatement of taxes, we're reducing our revenues to be able to pay the bills associated with the budgets we have. And so if we can find ways to lessen the burden on everybody, it would be very helpful.
Carol, I'm wondering if you can give the committee a sense of if we were to pass this or something substantively like it into law, and in a situation like you're experiencing in Berry, and I just want to say I did some volunteering in Berry. I saw what you all were going through, the basements that needed to be mucked out, the destruction. I'm very deeply sorry for what your community has been through with the flood. I mean, the impact was really great. So I have a few questions for you that I don't want to, don't want to get lost in the weeds and not recognize just how many people in your community were impacted and how much loss of property value and people's belongings. I mean, I just wanted to get that out on the table, but I'm wondering if we pass something like this, how you would envision the Board of Civil Authority kind of making a decision. Are you all thinking that it would be the kind of thing where you'd say, we're going to we have these 10 properties that are all in a similarly situated, and we're going to partially abate their taxes all at once? Or is there kind of a vision for what the typical class would look like in this situation, so I can wrap my head around a specific example?
Yep. I can give you a few examples. We have already done abatements on 5 properties that we considered, without having a legal definition for class. They fell into that category. All 5 had been destroyed. And so it was easy to hear them all at one time. I mean, obviously they each got an individual hearing, but since the circumstances were virtually identical, it was easy to deal with those five as a single class, as it were. We have properties where they were impacted by landslides, and so those kinds of circumstances, there are geotechnical reports that are involved with those particular properties, and so the kind of supporting materials would be the same for that particular class. We have properties that are river adjacent, and the impacts on them tended to be very similar, if not identical, across the board. And they had not only damage to their homes, but also to their property. They may have lost property through river wash. And so that would again be a class. So that's an example of the kinds of groupings that we'd be able to look at one set of circumstances spread over a group of properties.
And in the example that you gave of the five properties that, were sort of seen serially, but were considered similar by the Board of Civil Authority, what was the kind of abatement decision that came out of that?
In those five, all of them were granted full abatements for the year from the date of the flood. Obviously, the date of the flood was a few days into the fiscal year. And so we calculated things from the date of the flood through the balance of the year. So they received full abatement from the date of the flood through the end of June. And then going forward, any adjustments associated with those property will be addressed through reassessment of the property. And that's how future tax bills will be calculated and adjusted accordingly. But the abatement was calculated based on the whole year. The groups that we've got coming up through the month of February, some of them are properties that have not been repaired and may not be repaired. So they're seeking an abatement for the rest of the year. We have properties that were out of use for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, but have now been repaired and are in use again. So they're seeking maybe 1 quarter or 2 quarters of abatements. And that would be another sort of category for class.
Other questions? Representative Nugent.
I was on a BCA, so I should probably know this, but is there a requirement that there be a request for an abatement to happen, or is it possible for the town or city to do it proactively, knowing so much of the property has been damaged?
There is a requirement for a request. There isn't anything in statute that specifies the format of that request. We ask people to submit something in writing, but that can be an email. We ask that they identify which of the statutory criteria they're making the request under, because the one thing that is specific with abatements is that the authority of the Board of Abatement is limited to those statutorily allowed abatement opportunities that are listed in 1535. And so we do ask them to identify which of those criteria they're making their request under. And because I feel, as the Barre City Clerk and Treasurer, I actually sit on the Board of Abatement. And so I need to be really careful about ex parte communication, but I do feel that in my role, I can help them with process. I will help them to identify what criteria might be a good fit for them and what the process is. But I obviously can't give them advice on what to bring for any kind of evidence or testimony or that kind of stuff. But yeah, so that's what we do. We do ask them for something in writing.
Yes, I can just pile onto that having done that myself. Yeah, it could, like Carol said, it could be a simple 2 sentences on a sheet of paper, signed, Kate, please look at my situation, and now it draws the requirement, I guess I would say. It formalizes it to go forward. It's, at least that's the way we've done them, I know, and I believe it's all it requires. It's pretty simplistic. It doesn't have to be extravagant.
Well, I think, unless there are any other questions for Carol or Representative Anthony, I think we should go ahead and have Tucker come up and walk us through the actual language. And I've got a number
I
of
actually
process
have,
questions
and
I'm trying to see.
excuse me, I actually have a question, and I'm sure that Tucker will actually address it.
Yeah, go
In the
ahead.
bill, it refers to the properties being grouped by property classification, and I'm not exactly sure what's meant by that, but I'm sure that Tucker will cover it. So
Was one of my questions as well, but I was going to hold that until we get through. So we've given you a preview of what we're going to ask you, Tucker.
thank you. Well, I'll stay
Yeah.
on and listen. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Go ahead, Tucker.
Good morning, everyone. For the record, Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. H 641 is an act relating to the authorizing boards of abatement to hear like cases as a class. So highlight 3 terms that are going to come up quite a bit that sound awkward in the context of the way the language is written. Request, like, and class come up over and over again. Like means similar. The class broadly is going to be referring to the group of taxpayers. Think of a class action. And the request is the initial request from a taxpayer for abatement of the taxes. Jumping into the amendments in section 1, this amends 24 VSA section 1535, which provides the base procedures for abatement. It adds a new subsection E to cover the grouping of taxpayers as a class. So in subdivision 1, boards of abatement may, this is discretionary, hear a group of similar requests for abatement as a class. Provided, these are the provisos here, that first, the request shall arise from the same cause or event. So they are able to group taxpayers as a class, provided that they have the requests for abatement have arisen from the same cause or event. Second, that the board shall group requests based on property classification. Carol's question here, the chair's question, this would be whether this is residential, homestead, commercial, whatever the property classifications are at the local level. You've dealt, for example, with charter specific classifications for, I think, what is called RPO classification, recreation, parks, and outdoor spaces, right? So you could have many forms of property classification that would fall into this. If there is a better nuanced term of art to replace property classification here, then certainly amend the bill to add that and make it more clear. All right, moving on to page 2, the third requirement for this grouping can happen. The board shall provide notice to each taxpayer of that taxpayer's status as a member of the class. So if you're going to group these taxpayers together, you have to let each individual taxpayer know, we are going to group you as a class for purposes of hearing your request for abatement. Finally, that the taxpayer shall have the right to reject that status and pursue their own request as a separate action for the board. And that last one was put in there to ensure that if for some reason the taxpayer wants to pursue their action separately, which, you know, for example, maybe, well, my request actually has more specific components to it about my property and the damage that was done, or, you know, underlying causes that need to be considered, they can have that due process right to pursue their request separately. And then finally, a taxpayer, and this is under subdivision D, shall notify the board of the taxpayer's intent to pursue a separate action a minimum of 14 days before the board's hearing to consider a class request. So if you want out, you have to provide notice that you want out 14 days before the board takes up the class action.
I have a number of questions, but I want the committee to go first. So Representative Brewer.
Do these actions now set precedent for future decisions?
My impression is yes. The extent to which it is binding precedent on an appellate court or whether it is just binding on the individual Board of Abatement is not clear to me, and I would have to do more research on that. I do know that in many of the cases reviewing decisions by boards of abatement, there is a substantial amount of deference that the courts give to the local boards of abatement in their initial decisions based on a request.
So Tucker, I'm wondering before you take Representative Byron's question, if you could take a step back for the committee to get us on a level playing field here and just briefly describe who's on a board of civil authority, what is their authority, and then if the decision they make isn't acceptable to the taxpayer, what is the taxpayer's recourse?
Can you go through the last two questions so I can write them down?
What is the board of civil authority and who's on it?
Hmm.
What power do they have to abatement when they're serving as board of abatement? And then if the taxpayer does not like the decision that they make, what is their recourse? I know the answer to these questions, but I want to make sure we all do because it's really key to understanding the bill.
So first, Board of Abatement consists of, in the first part, the Board of Civil Authority plus some other specific officers that I'll get to in a moment. So the Board of Civil Authority means, in the case of a town, the select board and town clerk and the justices of the peace. When we're talking about a city, it's the mayor, alderman, city clerk, and justices of the peace. And in villages, the village trustees, the village clerk, and the justice of the peace. Those are your boards of civil authority. When you're talking about the boards of abatement, it is the BCA along with the listers and the town treasurer. I believe, okay, for cities and villages, it's the mayor, city clerk, alderman, justices of the peace, and assessors. Within this context, what power do they have? They have the power to hear requests for abatement. You got some of the bases for abatement from Representative Anthony. But they can hear requests to abate in whole or in part taxes, utility charges, including water and sewer, interest on those taxes or charges, and collection fees, or any combination of those things. Under the following cases, the taxes or charges are applied to people who have died insolvent, moved out of the state, are unable to pay their taxes or charges, interest and collection fees, where there's a manifest error or mistake of the listers, when real or personal property is lost or destroyed during the tax year, which is the context that you're hearing about this morning. Taxes or charges upon a mobile home moved from the town during the tax year as a result of a change in the use of the mobile home park land or parts thereof due to the closure of the mobile home park. And that's it, because the rest have been repealed. All right. There are specific procedures set out in the section. For example, there's the automatic trigger that if the board abates the amount of a tax or charge, it shall automatically abate any uncollected interest or fees. They have to provide a written determination for the record. And they can order that any abatement as to the amount already paid in the tax year can be issued as a refund or in the form of a credit against the tax or charge for the next year. Is that enough detail about the context?
I think that's good. So I think we're all up to speed on, there's a large group. It's typically the legislative body, listers, assessors, justices of peace for the municipality. Taxpayer applies for an abatement, a relief for some whole or part of their taxes for a given year. And then there are these specific criteria. We're pretty much talking about, in the case of Berry City, the flood, which is the loss of in whole or part of the property has been destroyed, right? So then the question that follows out of that is, when we're looking at if there was a decision made as a group, take the 5 houses that were flooded, beyond the date of the flood, all of their taxes have been abated. If the Board of Abatement in Berry City had decided we're going to only abate half of the value, and those property owners, one of those property owners said, that's, my property's been wholly destroyed, and wanted to appeal that, what's the recourse for the taxpayer who disagrees with the decision?
So taking a step back, it was the last question that you had asked and I didn't answer it. There is a route of appeal for a taxpayer to appeal to Superior Court. I can't recall if this is one of the instances. I know grand list appeals go to a hearing officer at the tax department first. I can't remember if abatement requests also had that intermediary step of going to a hearing officer. But I think
Carol might be able to chime in here and tell us what happens in practice.
There isn't an intermediary appeal option. It goes directly to the Superior Court.
Yeah, there is not.
Just clarifying question. When you were talking about the boards of civil authorities, did you say there are assessors on most of them or just particular kinds?
So when we were talking about the composition of the boards of abatement, just for cities, the assessors are included on their default boards of abatement unless they have a charter provision that's more specific.
Yeah, so the Board of Abatement in most cases has more people. It includes the Board of Civil Authority, but then it also has clerk, listers, assessors, depending on which function, right?
But just because like the assessor piece is interesting to me that it's not on all of them.
Sure. Go ahead.
I also wanted to take a step back because maybe wasn't clear in the context when I went through the bases for when an individual can make a request for abatement, where this may be used more commonly in that list. There's really only a few of those bases for the request where this would likely come up. When you have some sort of event that causes the destruction of a property is the one you're discussing this morning. And then the other two that might come up is, for example, the manifest error made by the listers. If for some reason there was some sort of error that impacted multiple property owners at the same time, that could be an instance where a group of taxpayers may take advantage of, a request for a class to say, hey, we were all impacted by this error. And then the other is the mobile home park closure, and mobile home park closes, all of the owners leave. That might be another instance where you have a class.
So was there any consideration to maybe, because we're talking, the context of this is from the flood, about having it the event requiring an emergency declaration in order to trigger the action or the possibility of the action?
Yeah. this is a default
Yeah.
procedure that would be built in now. Moving forward, boards of abatement would have the discretionary authority to group, a number of similar requests together as a class.
But the request has to arise from the same cause or event. So in the
Correct.
case of like
Yeah.
a disaster, that would be the event. In the case of a mobile home park closing, that would be the event.
Yeah.
Is that how?
Yeah, no, but I was just thinking like, just based on the context of why it was brought here, I was just curious if there was any discussion to isolate it to events that had an emergency declaration. Because I feel like we're opening up a broader conversation to the purpose of the thought process that got us to this bill. See what I'm saying?
Something that I didn't mention upfront is that in doing research on this, and I did inherit this from Abby at some point during the drafting phase of the year. It seems like from a lot of the decisions and some of the silence in this chapter about procedures for these boards of abatement, that there might already be some implied authority for this to happen. And unless it's, for example, in conflict with rules of civil procedure and could impact due process rights, that maybe this is something that boards of abatement can already do. It's not very clear in the law.
So. Scenario that I think gives me pause that I want to lay on the table is if a taxpayer has the opportunity to be in a class and they say, okay, so my decision is going to be considered along with these other similarly situated property owners who've been affected by an event. And then the Board of Abatement, for instance, let's say you've got 5 property owners, their properties were initially valued at some higher, all different amounts, but the Board of Abatement decides that they're going to have a flat amount, like $20,000 that they're going to abate for everybody in the class. And the property owner who has, where that's 20% of their property value is like, yes, that's great. And the one where it's only 4% of their property value says this is really unfair. Their only recourse once that decision was made, because the decision of the Board of Abatement is essentially final at that stage, their only recourse would be to go to Superior Court. If they had been grouped in the class, the decision had been made, and they disagreed with the decision, they'd have to appeal it to court.
Yes. That would be the avenue for appeal. You could add some guardrails around the procedures here. For example, stating that decisions for a class shall be based on a rate, instead of a dollar amount. So we're going to abate this percentage of your taxes rather than your example of having potentially aggrieved taxpayers based on disproportionate abatement. It's not property value. So, or I don't want to, as you've said before, build the plane while flying it, but a subdivision that says that, the decision of a Board of Abatement shall not result in disproportionate abatement for the taxpayers that have been grouped as the class.
Okay, so I think the proportionality is an important guardrail. The other thing that might help me satisfy my concern with the language as it's drafted is something to the effect that when the Board of Abatement notifies the taxpayers in the class that they are going to be considered as a class, that it is explicitly written in the notification that if they accept being in the class, they can't be heard individually, that they would have the right to appeal, but that right to appeal would be in Superior Court. So that we're very clear with folks, if they opt to be in a class for expediency's sake, that they are essentially foregoing their opportunity to be heard individually. I think we would need folks to be notified of that really explicitly.
Mhm.
Is that
That makes sense.
Representative Nugent?
I would just also like add that you have a right to request to be heard individually too. That might have been implied in what you're saying, but.
That's actually explicitly in here, but what I'm talking about actually is yeah, right. So am I understanding that correctly, Tucker? Because I want to make sure it represents, I'm not wrong about what Representative Nugent's saying. Within the 14 days, you can opt out.
Mhm.
I just want to add on to that, the ability for people to be, or the requirement that the board notify people of the consequences of what happens if they are essentially default being part of the class. Representative Chase.
Within that time period of successful notification rather than just notification being sent, because if the property is designated and they mail to the property and the person's not there, that doesn't count as notification.
How the notice is going out?
Wow, that's a. whole
Is it
nother-
certified mail?
Yeah, you were out
Certified
of town for 3 weeks.
correspondence.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah.
That's very good.
Yeah.
All right, so there are some things to think about here. So I think.
Great concept, potential unintended consequence.
Yeah, so we're obviously not gonna make a decision on this. I wanted to because of the urgency that had been expressed from the folks in Berry City to see if we could clear this up quickly. What I'd like to do is put some time on our agenda next week to pick this back up and maybe get some input from a couple of other potential stakeholders, trying to the league to weigh in. Trying to think of who would be a reasonable folks to talk about that deal with abatements, realtors, or we'll have to think about
Yeah,
who would have an opinion on this.
I mean, every town's got certainly their opinion or the way they do it, like I've done a bunch of them, but
Perhaps an attorney that specializes in this field.
Well, people who do like probate or maybe,
That's what I'm saying.
yeah,
it's a tough one.
yeah.
You want it to be a little bit removed, but
Yeah, so let's think about who we need to have in a weigh in on this, but I think it's worth trying to find a path. I just want to make sure that, Tucker said guardrails. I think the guardrails are important. Did any other thing, due process issues come up in the drafting process, Tucker, that we should be aware of?
No. So the big issues that I was requested to tackle were making sure that there was at minimum notice to the taxpayer of the class status and the ability to withdraw from the class and pursue an individual request.
What's the current notification requirement?
In the bill?
Well, in the bill, but also just, if you've requested an abatement. Right, so the taxpayer has to actually request it, then I think the way, now that I'm thinking about this, we've solved the sort of notification problem is if they're living someplace separately, then they would give that as their return address when they request the abatement. So it's not like they're put into a class and they've never had any contact since the disaster in this case. Because the taxpayer is actively filling out the form and checking the box that says why they're requesting the abatement, filling out, the reason for that request. And then it's the board, the clerk, who's responding with a letter saying your abatement hearing is going to be here. And if we pass this bill, it would also say you're going to be considered as a class unless you opt out. Am I understanding that process?
The process for notice would stay the same. And maybe Carol knows, but I would have to check to see if most towns are just following the guidelines of the rules of civil procedure for how to provide adequate notice to a party that has been, or an individual that has been granted party status in a contested case.
Yeah, Carol, do you have any context you could give us there?
Context, I'm not sure about context. I can tell you that statute puts the same notification requirements on the Board of Abatement that are on Board of Civil Authority for holding their hearings. And I think that's 5 days, which is why the 14 days may be problematic. Because it may be that that 14 days is outside of what's currently required by statute for warning a hearing. So that was one of the things that I had a question about.
Yeah, do you know what the warning requirement is? We should figure that out.
Well, warning would be different from individual notice provided to party. So let me look into it and see if there's any discrepancy between posting a warning for the hearing and providing to a party.
Okay, great. So before we move on from this, I will put some more time on for this next week because I think it's something worth us trying to figure out. And if towns are kind of doing this anyway because they have implied authority in some cases, I think it would be good to be more specific. So there is process here that actually is a little alarming to me, having sat on some of these abatement proceedings. So,
But we just don't want to have the oops in there, like, miss that.
Yeah,
So screwed it up, made it worse.
So we'll ask for feedback from a few folks and try to find a way to put the guardrails on so we all feel like we've given the flexibility that a city like Barre needs in this kind of disaster without, potentially leaving some property owners in a bad spot. If there's a unfavorable decision rendered, then they have to figure out how to go to court while their house has been destroyed. And I want to avoid that. All right. Any other questions before we move on from this? Great. Thanks, everybody. That was really great. I learned a lot there. Carol, anything else you want to add before we let you go?
I've got one thing, and I hate to add something that's a little outside of the scope of what you're working on, and it may be more of a question for Tucker than anything else. Excuse me. In the criteria that are listed in 1535. One of them says, and Tucker mentioned it, taxes in which there is a manifest error or a mistake of the listers. This has been one of the criteria that has had lots of different interpretations. And the handbook put out by the League of Cities and Towns says that the mistake can be made by anybody. It doesn't have to be the listers, and it comes down to whether there should be a comma in that sentence or not. With regards to whether it should say a manifest error, comma, or a mistake of the listers. And it might just be something that could be looked at. But I certainly don't want to hold up this good work on creating classes in these kinds of circumstances for the potential missing comma.
Well, I think we should ask our colleagues on Ways and Means perhaps to weigh in on that. I think that gets a little bit outside of our board powers and more, but
it's also the use of in which is discouraged. But yes, you could have a different interpretation, whether that's supposed to be a manifest error in the taxes or a mistake of the listers, or whether it's within the taxes, there's a manifest error or mistake of the listers.
Well, I think what you're usually getting at when that reason for an abatement request is used, right, is that the taxpayer disagrees with the either amount of tax or the assessed value of their property, right? And so the question here, whether the discrepancy was made in the creation of the bill or in the valuation. I mean, I think we should probably continue to cover both of those things, don't you, Carol?
Well, I think the broader interpretation is the right way to go. But I've also heard a lot of people say, no, it has to be, just because taxpayer A forgot to sign their check, therefore it was a late payment. They should still, that's not a manifest error of the listers, therefore they should still have to pay the late fees. So it can be down to that kind of granular level. So
I hadn't heard that one in my 6 years of experience on the BCA, but that's creative. I don't know if I want to solve that one. This is reminiscent of, the argument about whether there's a comma or a smudge on the original Constitution in the takings clause. Anybody familiar with that? This is
I heard whispers of that one.
yeah, this is a real thing. Is it a comma or a smudge? Thank you so much, Carol. We will pick this conversation back up next week and hopefully hear from a couple other folks.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Great. That was great. I'm glad that serious thing. Good to have a little levity at the end of our discussion there.
Absolutely.
So Tucker, we're trying to use your time really efficiently. And I know you've been working, with Representative Boyd and Representative Byron to try to, combine some of the, alcohol related policy that we had introduced into a potential committee bill. So we'll switch gears and take a look at that draft.
So the miscellaneous alcoholic beverages bill is posted on the committee's webpage. It is labeled as draft 24-0299, and we're looking at draft 1.1. You'll be familiar with many of these provisions as we move through, because I did listen in to some of the bill introductions about alcoholic beverages. So I think that you've heard about at least 3 of these. So the first section and second section work together. This is from a bill introduced by Representative Boyden, and it relates to the service of both on-premises alcoholic beverages and alcoholic beverages for off-premises consumption within the same contiguous premises. Are you all grounded in the classes of licenses? Do you need a 30-second refresher?
Why not?
Okay.
We got you.
It's always good to get that.
Hearing a couple sure why not, so let's
Okay. So you can divide the classes between on-premises and off-premises. So on-premises, think of like restaurants and bars. It's being served to you for your immediate consumption in the establishment. First class license is one of those, and that's for everything except for spirits and fortified wines. So beer, wine, cider, ready to drink spirits beverages. Third class license, also on premises, bars, restaurants, things like that, is for spirits and fortified wines, which are acquired through the Department of Liquor and Lottery. Okay. Fourth class license is also on premises, but it is a premises that is contiguous with a manufacturing location. Think of tasting rooms. Second class license is for off premises consumption, selling packaged, closed containers of alcoholic beverages. Think of the 802 Spirits locations, grocery stores, gas stations, and yes, manufacturing locations as well, because they will often have coolers where they sell their products. Okay, with that grounding, both of these sections have the exact same language. And it is language that is providing to those on-premises consumption locations the authority to also sell closed containers for off-premises consumption within a contiguous space. They don't need to have a separate building. They don't need to have dividers between the two serving and retail sales spaces. The language itself is aimed at informing either the Department of Liquor and Lottery or a reviewing court that the language in subdivision B1 in 7 VSA section 221 and in subsection B in 7 VSA 223, that those subsections shall not be construed to prohibit the holder of both on-premises and off-premises licenses from operating both of the licenses from within the same premises. And that the license holder may sell alcoholic beverages for off-premises consumption anywhere in their on-premises location. It's a long way to get at you can sell closed containers for retail sale within the same serving space as your on-premises location.
Yeah, I'm hearing what you're saying, Tucker, and I know, I think you answered this the other day, Matt, but just one more time, maybe on brew pubs as an example. Brew pubs got bar, cooler product. Isn't that already doing that, or is that
The
not
spaces are technically bifurcated.
theoretically, in theory,
No,
they're bifurcated?
no, functionally they are, not in theory, functionally they are. We're having the conversation right now about whether or not to allow them to blend together. So
I understand, but that is considered though bifurcated just by physical space.
And that's I mean, if you want to jump in, but it's the to operate the sale of the packaged container and the beverage to consume on site.
Yeah.
Per statute have to occur in two separate defined spaces.
In two separate registers, or
Used
could it be the same register?
Yeah, no, they're supposed to be tracked
Could be.
separately. Yep.
or at least track separately.
But it doesn't have to be two separate
Right.
registers.
It's gonna be like a cooler sale versus a bar sale.
You have two designated spaces which may or may not have a physical threshold. So if you think of the Lawson's serving space, you
Yeah.
pass through a doorway to get where the retail sales happen, and there is in fact a separate register. Zero Gravity's serving location in Burlington, there's no doorway that you pass through, but there is a clearly defined retail space that is separate from the first class serving areas that they have on either side. One question, I don't know if the department has provided comment on this, but I don't know how they're enforcing this if there's specific exceptions for manufacturers and the licenses that are associated with their manufacturing locations, because both of the examples that I just gave you are manufacturers who have on premises and off premises sales happening at their manufacturing locations. I'm not sure if there are rules that apply to the manufacturers that are different than would apply to a more traditional on premises serving location, such as, a bar in your village or city downtowns.
Certainly the one you bring up on Lawson's, I've been there, and yeah, exactly, it's a definitive.
Correct. Yeah, there's a clear understanding that you're doing one bucket as opposed to the other.
Yep.
So for a real life example, after many of us went to Norwich, at the garden hosted, Representative Police Rubio and I went to a place in town. We had a meal, sat at the bar. And he purchased, they had product that they were an extension business of that produced their own product, manufactured. And when it was purchased to leave, the transaction had to occur separately.
Yeah, couldn't throw it on your tab.
Yeah, and so it was completely defined, you know what I mean? And the product was housed clear on the other side of the establishment. And so it is a little wonky for the consumer to understand sort of what's going on. And then there's another example of this, the individual that brought this problem with their business. They're more of a retail operation, right? So there's actually two different buckets of function here, which was what he was kind of alluding to.
Yeah.
Where you have a second class that's blended as tasting, blah, 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 but then more of a second class. For what I'm describing with Representative Police Rubio and I was more of a bar and restaurant functioning almost kind of in the opposite flow.
Understood.
So, and that's what we kind of have to unpack here.
But what I'm hearing from you though is it literally could be, for lack of a term, air separating the space.
I mean, essentially it is. I mean, you're not going through a door, right? I mean, it's like, somebody put like painter's tape across the floor and you're like, I'm on the left side. I'm on the right side.
Yeah. In the cloud.
Figuratively speaking. So that's just sort of what it would look like kind of in reality.
Yeah, okay. No, I just wanted to re-clarify to make sure I had it. Because I think you can find scenarios where you could go like you're sort of alluding to.
Yeah. Are you more of a restaurant that's trying to sell a retail product, or are you a retail establishment that has like the ability to do like small pours so you can try and highlight the products you retail? Yeah. There's a total inverse to this.
Yeah, I can certainly see the rationale.
Any other questions on this piece? Let's keep walking through. Next up.
Okay, we're moving on to page 3. This is another bill that you reviewed. It was introduced by Representative Dolan of Waitsfield. And this is related to the special venue serving permits being expanded so that retail establishments broadly can acquire them. So you can think of this as some sort of special event that is happening at a space. Currently, it is available to art galleries, bookstores, public libraries, or museums are allowed to acquire these special venue serving permits so that they can serve alcoholic beverages by the glass to the public. Section 3 would amend that authority to remove specific reference to bookstores and expand it broadly to retail establishments. The definition of bookstore within subdivision 38 and 7 VSA section 2 is repealed. And in section 4, we have conforming amendment within the actual special venue serving permit section in subsection A to eliminate the reference to bookstore and add retail establishment. I feel the same way right now, but I'm a gentleman, so I'm holding back all this talk.
Look at the seat, we have a bottle of water sitting here or something, there, but I don't think we do.
You okay, Matt?
You're good? Okay. We're gonna do CPR or something, want to make sure he's.
And give Representative Byron a second.
I don't think anything.
He's got water. He's just, I think.
Oh, no, I was thinking for Tucker, you know, we had so.
Are you doing all right?
Yeah,
Right.
I'm rallying.
And like any, like coffee cups or paper cups over there, I'm just going.
We have him here.
Yeah, there you go. Gonna fight another day.
That's what I get for trying to swallow it. So
Been there, done that.
wow. All right, and we're back.
Are there any questions about the special venue serving permit language and the shift from bookstore to retail establishments more broadly?
Question I had is, all of these special venue serving permits, they go to the local board, right?
I believe that you are correct about that, but let's see.
There's still a vetting process. I need to review ones.
Yes, so in subdivision A1, the applicant for the permit has to have received approval from the local control commissioners.
Fine with me, because they can decide if the retail establishment, if there's, you know, been a history or there's been an issue, they have a concern, and it's only for that one discrete event that they can do that, right? It's a specific time, specific retail establishment if we pass this.
Yeah, and this came up with a jewelry shop, jewelry manufacturer in the district years ago when they were trying to just do an event. The ability to just
Sit and buy.
and it was like over the holidays too. It was just like a promotional thing, and like they had to bring in like a licensed caterer because they weren't a bookstore or a gallery. So, okay. Little narrative.
Right. Section 5, this is new to the committee. This amends 7 VSA section 253 related to sampling event permits. And if you recall, last session, one of the changes broadly to Title 7 was that what was formerly known as the festival permit was changed to the sampling event permit. And I actually can't recall what it was formerly called, but you amended another section of law to establish limited event permits. And this was intended to eliminate confusion about what types of festivals had to acquire a festival permit. So I think There's like the Onion Festival or the Book Festival was the example that kept being brought up. It wasn't for the purposes of sampling beverages manufactured by a Vermont-based manufacturer. It was for the purposes of celebrating books or onions or whatever the case may be. And they wanted to clarify that those sorts of non-alcoholic beverage focused festivals could acquire a permit to serve alcoholic beverages at their festival, and that the sampling events would be something separate. Within those corrections, one piece was missed, and that was ensuring that the sampling event permit holder could purchase invoiced volumes of alcoholic beverages directly from a wholesale dealer. So the existing language allows them to purchase those invoiced volumes from a manufacturer or packager. So this is adding wholesale dealer into the entities that they can purchase their invoice volumes of alcoholic beverages from.
It doesn't change anything about the event or who can get it. It's about where the permit holder can get their alcohol from.
Correct.
Questions about section 5?
I just want to I think this is more of a question for Tucker yourself. So because this was missed, excluded last year, I know that there was some timeline concerns with folks organizing various festivals that happened earlier in July 1. And I was curious if it's possible to do effective for this section only passage, or does that have to be done in the whole bill?
We can call out this section and give it an effective date on passage.
I know that the folks that brought this to us would like to see this go into effect as quickly as possible. Yeah.
I don't see anybody on the committee jumping up to object, so. Sounds reasonable. Thank you. It was just an oversight, like we just missed that as a potential source.
Yeah, I mean, it may or may not have actually been in a draft at one point and then got bumped around and yeah. So there was definitely off-session conversations about where did the language go.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Moving on to section 6, this increases the number of special event permits that may be issued to a manufacturer rectifier from 10 to 20 per year. And that's 20 per physical location. So yes, 20 for example, a farmer's market location in a given calendar year.
So a particular instance that resulted in this language being put here was someone who does events at Essex at the expo can only do 10 single events at that site under current statute. They're running into it now that we're out of events are happening. They actually can't facilitate all the events that they would normally participate in at that site, because it's now exceeding 10 events, but they have the slot.
Mhm.
They've just got to
Get the capacity.
yeah, so.
Yeah.
So to be clear, this is the key thing with this particular one is at the same location. This isn't providing more access to the satellite.
Yeah, because for the same physical, okay,
Same
yeah.
physical location is
Got
the
it.
key.
Got it, yep, okay.
All right, section 7.
No, go ahead. Dude, if you have one on this section, yeah, go ahead.
I think for all these up to the last section, I was just, and I think this might be a question for DLL, but wanted to know like what our senses of how many licensees this would impact across the state in total, and how much more it increases the potential like serving venues and areas.
That is definitely a question for DLO.
Yeah, we'll definitely pick this back up. We're just going through the walk through of the combined bill here, so that
Yeah, we have both Charles and Skylar on standby to come in and discuss these things. So, yeah.
Okay, in section 7, pivot for a moment to the lottery. This amends 31 VSA section 657, which is currently a report from the Board of Liquor and Lottery to the Governor and the General Assembly on or before the 10th day of January. It's going to shift that to a report from the department, which will be given to the governor and the General Assembly on or before the 10th day of March. One question that I had, and this is either for you all or potentially for the department, the language that I received for this section only changed the first 2 instances of board to department, which I think may make sense that the department is providing the report based on the board's activities and receipts under statute. But I just wanted to check to see whether this was correct or whether they wanted to change every reference to the department rather than the board.
I see. So in the second half of here, lines 8 through 11, where it talks about the board's actions being in the report and
Correct.
recommendation for legislation that the board deems advisable.
Correct.
Did they want that to, seems to make sense, but we should check on that.
Yeah. And this was language that was offered to us by the department, so I don't want to speak for their intent with the words.
Yeah, we'll definitely flag that when they come in. Yeah, Representative Wood.
I'm thinking of a different report that we recently went over from the summer government accountability meeting. That recommended that the legislature receive reports for the session. So I'm wondering if this is a conflict of 2 recommendations. Just something to consider in the future, yeah.
I think if the department is making recommendations that are different from what the board wants, they probably are gonna have some issues. So we should just clarify, what do they want the language to say here? I think what they're trying to get at is the department's gonna do the report on behalf of the board. I think they're just trying to clarify that, the board members aren't gonna write a report, but
Yeah.
is that?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the Summer Government Accountability Committee. They recommended that all reports come to us before the session. Am
Oh, I see what you're
am I
saying.
missing?
Oh, as far as the timeline.
Yeah,
deliver?
timeline, yeah,
Okay,
of
okay.
delivery. So they recommended November, here they're recommending March. 2 different people are giving
Okay.
recommendations.
That's an awesome question for them when we bring them in.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
Yep. No.
because this would be very much middle of session.
Mhm.
Very valid point.
Why did they move it to March?
It might be because like board meeting dates, perhaps, and I'm just speculating. Who knows?
Talk to them when they come in.
Yeah, we'll talk to them when they.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it wouldn't give us any time before crossover to actually take testimony and adopt legislation based on their recommendations.
Mhm.
Yeah. So actually, we probably want to go in the other direction and say, give it to us by what, December?
I always like the
Yeah.
December 15th date.
Have time to draft something, yeah. No, that's great. That's great. Okay.
Ready for section 8? Okay, so background, you'll recall last session that the liquor liability statute in Title VII was comprehensively amended to it was comprehensively amended, and part of the amendments to liquor liability in the state was a section that required every licensee of the department to acquire liquor liability insurance. And that the department, along with DFR, would adopt rules governing the type of minimum insurance coverage and amounts that had to be held by each licensee. This section kicks out the effective date of the mandate for liquor liability insurance from July 1st, 2024 to July 1st, 2026. So it extends the requirement for that insurance for 2 years.
That's, yep. Questions there?
And that's another one that was a recommendation or request to have the conversation from the department, so getting
Yeah.
deeper understanding as to why,
We'll have them talk about how all that's working in practice.
All right, section 9, this is going to deal with some very specific authority for manufacturers of vinous beverages and fortified wines under current law that is being proposed to be expanded by this section. 7 VSA section 271 governing manufacturers or rectifiers licenses. Subsection C, we're on page 6. Under current law, a licensed manufacturer of vinous beverages or fortified wines has authority to receive from other manufacturers licensed inside or outside of the state shipments of vinous beverages specifically to rectify with the licensee's own product, provided that the final product produced by the licensed manufacturer may not contain more than 25% imported vinous beverages. So the standard case that you might think of is if you're a fortified wine manufacturer, you're importing some of the base wine that you're then going to be adding spirits to fortify it and turn it into a fortified wine. Here, this eliminates all of the specific references to vinous beverages and fortified wines and expands this authority to manufacturers of all alcoholic beverages. So any manufacturer would be permitted to import alcoholic beverages broadly to then manufacture or rectify their own products, provided that whatever the final product is not more than 25% imported alcoholic beverages.
Not sure I understand
Oh, okay.
exactly what that is.
Do you want to take this?
Yeah.
I was thinking, I don't know if you had the same thought immediately of the ready to drink spirits category.
that I was also gonna bring up, vineyards as well, where they'll supplement the product, maybe on a port grow year with out of state product of the same varietal.
The vineyards would be permitted to do that.
Oh, no, I was just speaking broadly as the concept of the blend, but yes, so yes, with the alcoholic beverages, with the RTDs. I mean, this is just giving the ability to do.
I didn't know if some of the, the flavored malt beverage. I don't know if there are in-state malt beverage manufacturers that are making FMBs, but if they were to get a license to manufacture or rectify ready-to-drink spirits beverages and were combining their own base or importing a base malt beverage to then mix with a spirit to create a new canned cocktail that they could sell on the market, that would be an example.
As long as less than a quarter of it was the imported material. Is there a reason for the that limit?
So it's getting here. So it's gonna.
Why I said 25%?
Of product brought in.
Yeah.
There's. In my opinion, it falls into more of like a sort of a truth in advertising, right? You're pitching something that's made in Vermont. The majority of the product should not in Vermont. Okay. In my opinion, I don't know if that necessarily speaks to.
It's like Canadian maple syrup.
I mean, we have seen manufacturers in this state with products. Buy a lot of product from out of state repackaged here.
What if they just put a label on it that says in-state content?
What's that?
What if we just had them put a label on that said percentage of in-state content?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. When we have this conversation with folks, this was also part of this language.
So I just assume people are already doing this anyway, but maybe not. Maybe
But, like,
I'm
I-
misunderstanding that.
I believe there is a degree of this being practiced out in the real world. And so
Covers it.
clarifying things, how to clarify things out in the real world. So, but this is also the Charles. It's kind of
It's their world. Okay.
No, because basically the lower half of this was
Yeah.
requested language that they brought. So a lot of these questions I was being at us.
Got it.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chair, just, I'm sorry I'm late, had to present a bill up in general, but, I was just, the last little bit of discussion here makes me wonder if, H 662, Representative Mike Marcotte's bill, it had to do with, oh, did you already, guys already talk about?
We're talking about that right now. We're trying to get some more clarification on some practices that were, as I alluded to, this had been a problem in the past. So I was waiting to hear back from DLL about some information.
The idea is we might add that in
Yeah,
here.
yeah, it's still an active conversation. We just didn't have enough details to insert it into this.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Is there, then while we're on that, are there any other bills that are on our wall or things, ideas that are hanging out here that aren't in the draft miscellaneous yet, that are still kind of being kicked around by you and Representative Boyd and DLL, or things we should?
The only piece that I really feel like I want to see more detail on is the markup piece.
Okay.
There's obviously always other opinions of members and stakeholders when it comes to the miscellaneous alcohol bill, but at the moment,
Mhm.
that's the one that
Mhm.
might need to. And Lord knows what they'll do over there.
Well, we're gonna,
Yeah, I think there's one Senate bill we could probably expect.
Yeah, and it's a repeat of last year,
okay,
satellite tasting rooms.
okay.
Yeah.
But you're not recommending we work on that right now, let them
Correct.
send us a
Yes.
recommendation.
That was the piece that we removed from the bill at the end of last year.
Gotcha. Okay. Great. Any other questions about anything in here? We'll take testimony from the department at some point next week, right? Are we?
Yeah, we're gonna work on this next week.
Okay, great. So Tucker, thank you very much for doing both of these bills with us this morning. So we'll be able to break a little bit before lunch. We have Anthea's coming in at 1 o'clock with the annual technical corrections bill. It is a monster this year, from what I hear. But I don't think we're gonna spend a ton of time on it. I know a couple of us had a meeting at 2 o'clock about one of our other bills with the administration, so we won't take a ton of time after lunch. So next week, just to get a sense of kind of how the rhythm of things is gonna go. We're gonna try to work on several of the bills. I want to try to get to a place where the ethics bill is starting to come together next week, and maybe conceivably you might be ready for a vote the following week. A couple of the bills that seemed a little more straightforward, and things like the Waterbury Charter, probably going to take votes on next week. And then when we get to the following week, I would say after next week, there's probably going to be a couple weeks of us digging into a lot of committee discussion about the government accountability bill, doing final markup on the ethics bill if we can get there, really digging into the OPR bill. So I would imagine that next week we'll still have some time where folks are working outside of the committee on drafting on some of these things and bringing them to us to consider. But by the following week, I'd love for us to start to be able to move some of these kind of medium-sized things that we're working on. And maybe pick up a couple of the newer things that we've been tasked with. There's also a number of they're just smaller things along the way. I think we'll get an introduction on S-154 is something we have to do. I think the Vermont State Plane Coordinate System, so we can geek out about maps and global positioning.
I was just fascinated
for
by
just
the title of that.
won't take a lot of time. It's just kind of a thing we have to do to update, where is Vermont? I think every decade or something that has to be officially
Under road.
yeah. So those things are kind of fun, but yeah, some of these pieces that we've had kind of been walking through, I think. So on Tuesday afternoon, invited some folks to come in and talk about H549. That was the cannabis citing bill that we'll take a little testimony on.
Yeah.
That's the only thing we're gonna do with cannabis next week. Yesterday we heard, with the report that Pepper had brought us. I'm gonna try to work with Chair Pepper and his team on turning the recommendations that they had from that report into some language to replace some of the language that's in the draft bill that we have been looking at. So I don't think we'll get to that until the following week. So I won't torture you all with any more of that conversation next week. Yeah, so we've got a bunch of work ahead. This has been good. I feel like we're making some progress here, and we'll be sure to put H641 when I can figure out when we can get some of those stakeholders in next week. But I'd like to try to figure out a way with that tax abatement bill that we heard earlier this morning to move that quickly if we can all get comfortable. But those of us who've been on BCAs, I had a little bit of the heartburn about some of the ideas we heard there, and Representative Higley, if you missed some of that, I can bring you up to speed on the discussion in here. Was really good. I think we got a lot on the table. It's an interesting thing, the idea of doing abatements by class if there's a natural disaster kind of thing that happened with a flood, but there's some guardrails and due process issues that I think we would want to make sure we have covered. So
Did they come up with a definition of class or categories or whatever, or no, is that where there's a real issue?
I think the way the bill's constructed, it's defined by there's an event, and then the people who've been similarly affected by that event become the class. And so it's really the Board of Abatement gets to define what the class is, but it has to be tied to properties that have been affected by a single event.
Okay, so it's not looking at the properties similarly. It's taking each one of those separately as far as the amount of damage or the time that it was damaged and all that, but they would be thrown into a class of if they were all affected in some way by a flood.
Yeah, so that's something I think we've got to work out a little bit as we take testimony. I think my understanding is that the Board of Abatement, if they had a class, they'd be able to make one decision. So for instance, if they were going to say all these properties on a block were destroyed, they could say there was the date of the flood and we're going to completely abate the taxes from the date of the flood on for this year and make one decision for that class that was similarly affected. So you're having some of the same thoughts.
But it's also outside the scope of a flood. It could be like a unified grievance with a reappraisal process.
Or a mobile home
Yeah.
park closes and all of the mobile homes are moved off the property.
I guess while we're on the topic, the thing I'm struggling with right now is I just feel like that opens up a very broad bucket to people who want to engage as a group with a range of issues. This came up as a flood conversation. Do we consider it that it has to be as the result of a disaster declaration or an emergency order, as opposed to just like a bunch of people pissed off their taxes went up?
Well, I think what's clear is it's the Board of Abatement that gets to decide that it's a class, not the taxpayers have to request. But if there are taxpayers that are making a similar request that's based on the same event, then the Board of Abatement could decide to say, oh, we're going to treat all of you as a class unless you opt out.
No, and I understand that part. I was just trying to, I'm just asking the question broadly because I'm asking myself. I haven't defined my personal position yet. I just wanted to articulate it that way, that it came up as a result of a natural disaster that fell under, these emergency declarations. Do we want to keep it sort of more narrow focus, or do we want to allow it to be a much broader conversation?
Well, I think about something like if you had an entire block burned down in a city because of a fire, there wouldn't be an emergency declaration, but it's a similar kind of a thing. And I'd be okay with letting the Board of Abatement make that decision, but it's more about, do we grant this power with certain guardrails, and what are those guardrails? So I think we're gonna have to really dig into that if we want to move this.
I know, I just wanted to open that thought up. That
No, no, it's a good one. It's like, where are the filter points of, and when do we allow this kind of a thing? And the big thing that we wrestled with a bit, Representative Higley, was the sort of recourse, right? So I would want anybody who was being considered as part of a class to know before they went to that abatement hearing, and as they're making a decision about whether to do that for expediency's sake, or if they wanted to opt out and be considered individually, to know that if they stay in the class that's been established, that if they don't like the ruling of the Board of Abatement, they're going to court if they want to appeal it. There isn't some like way to to reapply to the Board of Abatement. Like, once the Board of Abatement makes that decision as a class, it's just like an individual decision. It's the final decision of the board, and then it goes up to the court for an appeal. So
Thanks for that.
yeah, that was the thing I brought up as like my major concern. And I think if we can make it clear what the circumstances are, and that the taxpayers who might be considered as that class, that it's clear to them. The issue is, it could advantage a lot of taxpayers in the situation of Barry, like they were talking about, you know, we're doing a full abatement from the flood on for this group, and those decisions could get rendered more quickly, and it could help people out who've been flood affected. So there's a tension there that I think we need to think through.
Yeah.
All right.